This is the Fifth Estate Winning Headlines, your media police post. In this segment, we summarize some of the headlines that you may have missed this morning, but we also take a look at the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country. Today is the 28th of May 2021, and I am 2J.
I'm 2M.
And I am GK. In case you missed the headlines, here they are. In the Daily Nation, bitter truth. In the Standard, it's another bombshell for Uhuru. And in the Star, Uhuru ignores Ruto calls for political truth.
Quite negative, all those headlines.
What a bunch of nonsense from the Star.
Well, they're reading something.
Well, it's nonsense completely. This Friday, we will address William Ruto. And we will begin by citing a moment described by Chinua Achebe.
Okay.
It was a moment when men were men and women loved it that way. It was a moment of hard decisions, but why women loved it is because men rose to the occasion.
Wow.
Men read the signs of the times and adjusted their choices accordingly. William Ruto thinks that the government of national unity is aimed at destroying him. And he is right. It is designed to destroy him in the moment, but not in the future. And if he does not read the signs of the time, it will destroy him completely. The wave of the moment is currently against him. And that's because when Elohim the Almighty wants to make a man president, he thrills the man with the idea of becoming president. Then he ruthlessly skills the man. He bends him without breaking him. He breaks his will without breaking his spirit. If Elohim the Almighty elects a man to become president, he ruthlessly perfects the man. William Ruto, however, is resisting the ruthless work of God. And if the ruthless work of God is a unity government, the unity government will be ruthless on him. In essence, Ruto must know that no one since Jomo became president in his first attempt. If Ruto continues to resist the ruthless work of God, he might as well forget ever becoming president.
Wow. Okay. I mean, I do agree about reading the Times. I think his speech yesterday at the National Prayer Breakfast was kind of alluding to the fact that he's catching up with what everybody else is trying to talk about. No?
Being devious.
So today I want to submit that Kenyans are afraid of change. And to be fair, it's not really our fault. Even research has shown that individuals have a bias for preserving the status quo. But unfortunately, this has actually become our problem in politics. Status quo, as we know, explains the current state of affairs. It applies to the way things are as opposed to the way things could be. But when you choose to live in the status quo, you're failing to see the potential for transformation. When Uhuru Kenyatta took office, his vision for country was informed by reviving the dreams of our founding fathers. This will be his legacy, but also a way to fix the problems of our 2010 constitution that makes our politics so unsustainable. But Kenyans have decided that amending the constitution is not for them. Not because they have any good reason, but because they are stuck in a cycle of status quo bias. Simply put, the status quo bias is evident when people prefer things to stay the same by doing nothing. It is paralysis by inaction. I am yet to see one good argument for why we shouldn't change the constitution, whether through referendum, by parliament, or something else. Tell me how more money to counties is a bad thing.
Yes.
Convince me why we should encourage a winner-takes-all presidential system that divides the country every 5 years. Make me understand how expanding the executive to include more ethnicities and more backgrounds could be negative for the country.
Exactly.
The answer is simple.
Yeah.
There are no good reasons.
Yes.
And there are no alternatives that have even been presented.
Yeah.
So because Kenyans are so afraid of change, they have conditioned themselves into this state of a status quo bias. The president has invited us to have a national conversation about the state of our politics, and we're foolishly ignoring him. So what is my point here? If Kenyans are unhappy with the current administration, or even the one before it, well, surprise, surprise, they are all fruit of the same constitution.
Yes.
The next constellation of political actors will be born of the very same pool, and someone will continue to benefit from keeping things the way that they are. The best that we can do on this panel, I propose, is to lift the veil of ignorance and encourage Kenyans to pick up a book,
Yes.
ask some questions,
Yes.
and actually understand for themselves what proposals the amendment bill actually presents.
Yes.
Failing that, maybe Jeshi can be organized to
Yes.
teach us a lesson or two.
Yes.
And speaking of Jeshi, today I was inspired by the amazing work that our very own defense forces have done for the country. The Kenya Defense Forces, also known as KDF, comprises of 3 services:
Yeah.
the Kenya Army, Kenya Navy, and the Kenya Air Force. And the President in Kenya is the Commander-in-Chief of all the armed forces, in
Yes.
case some people forgot. And the present KDF was established under the Article 241 of the 2010 Kenyan Constitution and is governed by the KDF Act of 2012. Though the KDF is primarily tasked with defending the country against external aggression, KDF has become an integral institution deployed by the president to get stuff done. Earlier this week, I submitted that the president was indeed a man in a hurry. He uses KDF because they sense his urgency and high standards.
Yes.
For one, military operations work toward clearly defined, decisive, and attainable objectives. 2, they have both the unity of effort and unity of command. Efforts are harmonized across agencies, and there's a clear line of responsibility. There's no time for petty politics here. This is why KDF has had such an impact so far. In 2020, they took charge of the Kenya Meat Commission.
Yes.
And KMC is as old as our post-colonial democracy.
Yes.
And now KMC is witnessing a return to profitability.
Yes.
Where it took farmers 4 years to be paid, it will now just take 72 hours. It is KDF engineers that helped rehabilitate the old Nairobi-Nanyuki 240-kilometer line, which has not been operational for the past 2 years or so. KDF was also in charge of revamping the 217-kilometer line from Nakuru to Kisumu, this railway. And the railway had been abandoned and neglected for almost 2 decades.
Wow.
The full functioning of this railroad will provide seamless transportation from Mombasa port to Kisumu, of which the Kenya Navy engineers have worked to reviving
Yes.
and restoring the ship called MV Uhuru and the port of Kisumu itself.
Yes.
And then we go further. In the midst of a pandemic in 2020, the KDF Corps of Engineers renovated 31 schools in an exercise that lasted just 90 days at a cost of only 129 million. Then we go to the electrical and mechanical engineering wing of the Kenya Army, which was also launched last year in October. And their job is to recover unserviceable vehicles. And so they were deployed to the NMS, the Nairobi Metropolitan Service, and they repaired some vehicles, a total 83 that had been grounded for more than 8 years.
Wow.
So to this, I absolutely salute the president and KDF for getting stuff done by any means necessary.
Oh,
Continue to
completely.
do so.
And I think getting stuff done also at a reasonable cost.
Yeah.
I think with the port of Kisumu,
Yeah.
they had been quoted, a 3 billion shilling price tag,
Yeah.
and KDF said, no worries, we'll do it for, I think it was
300 million shillings.
There you go.
So,
Democracy is overrated. We should just get rid of this cream of the crop called politicians, and we get in Jeshi to do it.
Jeshi mode.
And if the constitution says we have to do democracy,
Yeah.
then we ignore it.
So we had 3 headlines, guys: bitter truth, bombshell, or Uhuru ignoring Ruto.
can we give ourselves a winning headline? Honestly, I think we contributed more to, thoughtful conversation as opposed to those negative headlines.
Absolutely.
There you have it. No winning headlines for today.
Now, our final thought, it is inspired by a book entitled On Heroes, Hero Worship and the Heroic in History by Thomas Carlyle.
Before we go, can we do a summary?
Please
Yes.
go
So
ahead.
this whole week, we've been looking at one book, and the book talks about the great man theory, which was proposed by Thomas Carlyle in 1840 in a series of lectures. Carlyle's great man theory posits that history is shaped by singularly great individuals whose common abilities have a decisive effect on the course of events. Carlyle saw history as having turned on the decisions, works, ideas, and characters of heroes, giving analysis of 6 types: the hero as divinity, a divinity as a prophet, as a poet, as a priest, as a man of letters, and the hero as a king. On Tuesday, we began with the hero as a king and looked at the life of Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell's rule as Lord Protector was short-lived, and his legacy has been complex. On one hand, he has been labelled as an ambitious schemer and hypocrite corrupted by power, but on the other hand, Cromwell has been praised as a political visionary inspired by God to reform government, law, and society. On Wednesday, we looked at the second lecture of the book on the hero as a prophet. In The Hero as a Prophet, he identifies Muhammad as the representative. The author declared his admiration for Prophet Muhammad, praising Muhammad's strength, sincerity, and genuineness. He argues that these qualities enabled Muhammad's leadership and the dissemination of Islam. And on Thursday, we looked at the third lecture on Hero as a Poet. In the lecture, Carlyle talks about Dante and Shakespeare, and he gives praise for Dante's poem Divine Comedy and depicts Dante as a hero poet that lived through the ages. We also had a lively conversation about Shakespeare and his impact across the world and generations.
A lively conversation, I like that.
To be polite.
To be polite. And so today we look at the hero as priest, and this chapter focuses on Martin Luther, but also on the Scotsman, John Knox. Yeah. So I'll look at Martin Luther first. And so we know him from the Reformation period, also called the Protestant Reformation, which was the religious revolution that took place in the Western Church in the 16th century. And of course, its greatest leader was Martin Luther.
Correct.
So Luther sparked the Reformation in 1517 by posting the 95 Theses on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany. And these theses were a list of statements that expressed Luther's concerns about certain church practices, largely the scale of indulgences, but they were also based on Luther's deeper concerns with church doctrine. So just for some context, an indulgence was part of the medieval Christian church, and it was a significant trigger in this Protestant Reformation. So basically, by purchasing an indulgence, an individual could reduce the length and severity of punishment that heaven would require as payment for their sins, or by the church, so they claimed. So you buy an indulgence for a loved one, and they would go to heaven and not burn in hell.
Nice.
You buy an indulgence for yourself, and you wouldn't have to worry about that affair that you've been having. So this system of reducing sin and punishment worked well to get the work of the church done. But then it went very wrong. Complaints about selling forgiveness spread wildly. A wealthy person could even buy indulgences for their ancestors, relatives, and friends who were already dead. So Luther's ideas spread throughout Europe, and they were developed further. And the Reformation led to revolution, war, and persecution. And in the end, many people and governments adopted these new Protestant ideas, while others remained faithful to the Catholic Church. And this is what led to that split in the church.
Yes.
So Carlyle reflects on the great courage of Martin Luther as a hero, as priest, and he talks about his bravery, courage, and integrity. And in Luther, Thomas Carlyle sees a man who was simple and honest and was not setting himself up to be great. And Carlyle actually emphasizes on the nature of the hero rather on the accomplishments of the hero. And so Luther, I guess as a hero, as priest, did what had to be done for society.
Nice.
I love it. I love it, especially the corruption part.
And selling forgiveness.
Yeah, it seems like something Karen would practice. Anyway, when Carlyle begins to describe Knox, John Knox, here is how he describes him. He says, this Knox cannot live but by fact. He clings to reality as a shipwrecked sailor to the cliff. He is an instance to us how a man, by sincerity itself, becomes heroic. It is the grand gift he has. And for those that don't know, Knox was much younger than Luther. Now, when Knox was born, Luther was about 26 years and had already been a priest for 2 years. At the age of 25, Knox was ordained a Roman Catholic priest.
Wow.
And it was not until he was 40 that he became a Protestant convert. 25 years after the 95 Theses were nailed to the door of the Wittenberg Church. Now, I think that was done by Martin Luther. Anyway, there are two things that led to him being turned into a Protestant. Knox was greatly affected by a man called George Wishart, who strongly maintained the truths of Scripture. A short time after, Knox became acquainted with Wishart. The latter was captured and burned at the stake at the command of the Romish cardinal. 2 years after, he had renounced Roman Catholicism. Knox himself was captured and was made a galley slave for a period of 19 months. It is reported that during this time, his health was ruined. Under pressure from the English authorities, Knox was finally released. The other outstanding feature of Knox was his fearlessness. When he stood before Mary, Queen of the Scots, it was not he, but she, who who trembled. He condemned her to her face for her worldly lusts, for she was the one who craved the corrupt fashions of the day, and for her false and hypocritical worship of God. At least on one occasion, Knox left the queen shedding tears and anger of anger and humiliation at his rebukes. A whole queen, can you imagine? But more importantly, without Knox, Scotland would never have been converted from a nation of Roman Catholics to one of Protestants, if it was not for Knox. In fact, if Knox had not turned Scotland into a Protestant nation, Protestant England would not have existed. And that's because Scotland could have been used as a base for forces of Spain and France, which were Roman Catholic, to advance against England itself. The Pope could have directed armies friendly to himself to march against England and force Roman Catholicism upon that country. That was the desire of the Pope.
So Knox saved them from the Catholics.
Yes.
It was interesting because I was reading this and I heard that John Knox actually, he died in poverty and was largely forgotten.
Yeah.
Most of us actually can, if you have heard of the PCA church in Kenya.
Yes,
That?
the Roto. PCA
Presbyterian. It's interesting. So now I've made roots, right?
Yeah.
Because he actually was instrumental in establishing Presbyterianism.
Yes.
And if you look back, we're told that the Church of Scotland mission to Kenya came in the early 1900s.
Yes.
And they're the ones who then set up PCEAs, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
And one of their most evangelical enterprises was setting up Alliance High School in 1927.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so a lot of the churches we go to, if you're part of the Presbyterian Church,
Yes.
it started with John Knox.
Yes.
Wow.
And so he helped to establish this when he met a man called John Calvin
Yes.
in Geneva.
Absolutely.
And Calvin and Knox meet.
Yes.
And his view of religion is greatly influenced, and he changes his theological thinking. And so Knox's philosophy in the background was that a man with God was always in the majority. And so he has this huge influence in Scotland about how the Church of Scotland should be. So much so after his troubles being imprisoned and whatnot, he gains this influence. But what he does is he created a new order of service and a new confession of faith and something they called the ecclesiastical order, also known as the Kirk. So the Kirk is also a nickname for church in Scotland. And the Kirk was to be the most important social religious institution in Scotland for many centuries. And so this was made up of a congregation of elders, bishops, who were entrusted with the government of the church and enforcing Christian teachings and morality to society. And so Knox also published this first book of discipline, which sets out the duties of clerics and enabled the transfer of property from the old church into this new entity that he had created. Under Knox, priests became ministers, bishops served as superintendents, like he proper institutionalized the whole thing.
Oh, wow.
And he did not believe that he was creating a new church. In his mind, he was reforming it. And that's what Carlyle keeps telling us, that both Luther and Knox were these great reformers of institutions that already sort of existed. So in 1592, we set up the full Presbyterian system, and it was adopted by the Scottish Church and Parliament. And this was composed of courts made up of ministers and elders and a whole spiel. So what Carlyle says is one word more as to the letters of Knox's work. The unforgivable offense that he thinks Knox made was to promote this idea of theocracy. And theocracy is this government of God. Yeah. The idea that kings, prime ministers, and all manner of persons should walk according to the gospel of Christ and understand that this was their law, supreme over all other laws.
Wow.
And he hoped that to see the petition, thy kingdom come, no longer an empty word, so that everybody lived by this. So theocracy now is, so the kind of theocracies you see now is sort of like the Vatican, right? Vatican City, Yemen, Saudi Arabia. So it's typically it was a type of rule over earlier civilizations, because they really believed in that whole divine
right of
and the religious law. So your state is basically surrounded or run by religious law. So it's very interesting. I liked it. The English was very hard.
Yeah, and I guess we never got to talk about the great woman theory.
Yeah, because there were no
women involved.
Yes. No. So next time. I'll end with this. Martin Luther told us, every man must do two things alone. He must do his own believing and he must do his own dying. It's very dark for the
I think
weekend.
you piqued Tuam's interest.
God bless.
Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, but find us on TV on GoTV, Prime Peter, and Star Times.
See you.